Hello, how are you doing? Sometimes I get a bit sad thinking that I will never, in a million years, have enough time to read all of the books that I'm interested in reading. And I think that it is important for us readers to take our time with what we're reading and savor it and really enjoy the experience of a book, rather than racing through it or trying to read as much as possible just to get through all of the books that you want to read. But I also think that it is perfectly fine to enjoy browsing through books you want to enjoy. And part of the pleasure of reading for me is sifting through all of these possible books that I could read, have the potential to read, and all of the stories they contain. And that's part of the great experience of booktube, of sharing that excitement. And which is all little preamble to say I have a big pile of new books that I want to go through and discuss and talk about, because I really enjoy looking through these books and thinking about the possibilities of what might be my next read. So starting off with a novel called Civilisations by Laurent Binet, and I picked up this book in a London Review Bookshop because recently I got to spend a wonderful afternoon with Sarah from her YouTube channel, Hardcover Hearts, and we met in the shop and we had a good browse looking through the books and discussing lots of different books. And she pointed out this book to me, which I don't think I had heard of before, but I definitely heard of this author before, but not this particular book. And it came out a few years ago, and it's such a brilliant story idea. It's a kind of alternate history where the Incas and the Aztecs, rather than their civilizations being colonized and taken over and destroyed, they travel to Europe and become the colonizers of Europe. And so she explores that in this story, that concept, which is such a great idea. And I think it sounds so fascinating. And Sarah spoke of it so highly that, I'm really excited to read this. Next, I have a couple of nonfiction books, which I got specifically because a few weeks ago I was reading the novel Remote Sympathy, and I read a few hundred pages of it and decided to put it aside. But this novel raised a number of questions which people were discussing about whose stories should we be focusing on when looking back at a wide-scale societal tragedy like World War II and groups of people that were oppressed. And in this novel, Remote Sympathy, a thread of the novel, one of the storylines is about a man that was imprisoned and incarcerated and suffered and separated from his family. But then other storylines were focusing on German SS officers that were complicit with what was happening in the war, and a number of people were uncomfortable with that section of the story, and I definitely think that in literature, in fiction, in novels, we should include everyone's point of view to understand situations, really difficult situations like this. But I also tend to be more sympathetic, obviously, with the victims of large-scale crimes like this and people that are oppressed. And so I did want to read more literature about World War II from the perspective of people that were either victims of that or who survived it and were able to still tell their stories, because so many people weren't able to tell their stories. And I came across this publisher called Amsterdam Publisher that really specializes in the stories of World War II victims and survivors and telling those stories. So the first book is called Krisia's Silence by Ronny, Hein, and it tells the story of a girl and her mother who were taken to a concentration camp, and many of their family members were able to buy their freedom and escape that situation, but she and her mother weren't able to do that, but they did survive. And so it's the story of their lives through the war and after that, and the really big cost of maintaining silence after experiencing such a devastating, experience like this. And then there's also a book called The Redhead of Auschwitz by Nechama Birnbaum, and it's told from it's the story of a woman named Rosie, who as a girl had bright red hair and was told that this was a curse, and she was taken to a concentration camp where her hair was all shaved off, and she did survive that experience, but didn't speak about it for a long time. And so her granddaughter pieced together her story and wrote this biography about her grandmother, describing her experiences. And so these are two books that I'm quite interested in reading. Next, I have a short story collection also concerning war, but this much more about the current war in Ukraine, because we all know there's been long-standing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and this is a short story collection called Lucky Breaks that was actually first published in 2018, but the stories are obviously still very relevant because they all focus on women in the margins of Ukrainian society, and so telling a number of different stories using really unique points of view. I think the authorial voice uses some really interesting techniques to tell these stories, and it's obviously the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is something that I still thinking about and listening to news about daily, and that I find really upsetting, and I think it's great that we have some fiction to get some insight into that experience. Then I have a brand new novel which also concerns war. I seem to have a lot of books that concern war here, but it all sound really good. So this is Bad Relations by Cressida Connolly, and it's a novel about a man who had some experiences during the Crimean War, which seriously affected both his life and the lives of future generations of his family. So it focuses on his story, but also then travels forward in time, showing how the consequences of what he experienced still reverberated throughout these other generations, and I've just heard such good things about this book. Then I have a debut novel called God of Mercy by Okezi Nwoka, and this is a story of an Igbo village which has a lot of religious traditions and faith, and it's quite a traditional village, but their faith and their ideas are challenged when a girl is born in this village who can fly, and so it's following her story and her fate and how this village transforms because of her. Privilege by Guinevere Glasfurd, and this is a novel which I'm quite keen on, even though I tried reading one of this author's novels before called The Year Without Summers, and I just wasn't able to really get into that book because there were so many different storylines of it that I was finding it a struggle to sort of keep them all in my head. But this author quite often writes about literary history, and this novel sounds like a much more concentrated story because it's set in 18th century France and is set in a time when books weren't able to be printed without royal permission, and so there were some undercover books that were being published and distributed and circulated amongst people, and it focuses on the story of a girl that is cast out of her village and moves to Paris because her father is disgraced, and also a number of other characters that are involved in this kind of undercover like literary scene of the time. And it sounds like such a interesting story about a time period I really don't, and place that I don't know all that much about, so it sounds really good. Then I have a collection of short stories which were first published in the 1980s but are just being published in this new English edition, and it's called Moldy Strawberries, which is one of the most unappealing book titles I've come across in a while, but they sound so fascinating, these stories by Caio, Fernando, Abreu, who, because they were written in Portuguese, he is a Brazilian writer, and they were stories about the military dictatorship of the time in Brazil, and also the effects of the AIDS epidemic throughout Brazil, which I've never read about before. And so, yeah, a lot of these stories concern that, and because he was writing so frankly about issues in the country at the time, he faced a lot of persecution. Some of these stories were banned or censored, and I think he had to leave the country. So yeah, sounds so fascinating. Lacuna by Fiona Snyckers, and this is such a fascinating sounding story. It's the author is South African. It's set in South Africa and is about a young woman who is gang raped and the effects of that. But one of the consequences of that was her story was fictionalized in J.M. Coetzee's novel Disgrace, and so you can see the parallels between these two, the covers of these two books, and how they reflect each other. And so in this novel, she is pursuing the actual author J.M. Coetzee and trying to insert her story, which is kind of referred to in Disgrace, but her story isn't fully told, so it's her trying to reclaim her own story, which is such a fascinating basis for a novel. I have another debut novel called Nightcrawling by Leila Mottley, and this author is a youth poet laureate in Oakland, California, and this novel is set in that city and is about a teenage girl who doesn't have a support network that she needs in her family, and so turns to street walking and gets arrested for that, and the police try to make a deal with her for her release, and this sort of causes her to be at the center of a kind of media storm, and this is based on a real life incident. So yeah, sounds like quite a harrowing story. Next, I have a couple of newly published poetry anthologies, which are so beautiful. The covers of these are so beautiful, and the first is actually a reissue of a poetry anthology called The Fire People, which was edited by Lemn, Sissay, poems by Black and Asian British writers, and they include a number of writers such as Jackie Kay and Malinka Booker and Selena Godin, and a whole range of authors that I've not read before. But then there's also a new anthology that called More Fiya, also with contributions by Black and Asian British writers, and it's edited by Caio whose poetry collection I read a while ago, and I admired a number of his poems. And and this includes a number of poets like Dean Atta, and that I've read before, others I've not. Also Rachel Lawn, whose poetry collection is so beautiful and wonderful, and and a number of other authors that I've not read before, but I'm looking forward to dipping into their work by exploring these anthologies. And I just love these covers. Then I have a new novel called We Had to Remove This Post by Hannah Bervoets, who's a Dutch author, and this is the story of a young woman that takes a job at a company she's not allowed to name, whose social media platform she's in charge of reviewing some posts of pictures and videos and text posts that are considered to have offensive content in them, and or that are relating conspiracy theories that are being perpetuated, and so she takes this job for money, even though she doesn't enjoy working there and doesn't want to be doing it, but is just taking it to earn a living. And then she gradually begins to question the morality of what she's doing, and the whole social media platform in general. So it's dealing with a lot of those modern issues to do with modern day technology and social media. Then I have a memoir called The Peanut Factory by Deborah Price, which is about South London in the 1970s, in a kind of group of post-punk individuals that were living in various squats throughout South London, and so it's about that whole kind of counterculture or subculture during that time, which I'm really fascinated about since I live in South London, and to learn more about areas of this city which I inhabit and which don't really know all that much about, but which came before me. So it sounds really fascinating. Then I have a few more kind of genre novels, including this novel Dear Little Corpses by Nicola Upson, and who's written this whole series of detective fiction all around a real life detective fiction writer called Josephine Tey, who is considered, one of the great writers of sort of early to mid 20th century Britain, and that kind of golden age of detective fiction. And she takes this writer and has made a whole series where the historic writer is a detective herself investigating these cases. And so this is set prior to World War II, and when children were being evacuated out of the city of London, and a girl goes missing, and so she investigates this and what happens to this girl in this case. And I just think it's such a brilliant idea for a series of detective novels to have this concept. And I have a novel which I guess could be considered like a thriller / sci-fi story called Tell Me an Ending by Joe Harkin, which is a story about a company that is able to extract people's bad memories. If they have traumatic or really upsetting memories, they can have them extracted. And it's about a group of individuals that get a letter saying that this had happened to them, and if they want to, they can get these memories back. So then it's the question of like, do you want to know about what you've previously chosen to forget, and the curiosity like surrounding why did I have this memory extracted? And so yeah, dealing with all of those questions, which sounds like quite an interesting concept for a novel. And finally, I have a new novel which is the first in a new trilogy of novels about early Tudor queens by Alison Weir, called Elizabeth of York, The Last White Rose. And this novel is about Elizabeth of York, whose father was king, but then when he dies, her uncle takes over, but then there's a rival for the throne, and so it's about her story, and she's considered like the first queen of the Tudor period, and so following her very dramatic story. I've not read Alison Weir's fiction before, but I know my mother is a big fan of it, and I'm a big fan of this period of English history, and I've always wanted to, so I think it'd be quite exciting to get in on the first novel of this new trilogy that Alison Weir is bringing out. So yeah, that sounds really good too. So those are, oh, I almost knocked them over. Yeah, these are all of the new books that I'm interested in reading. I'd like to know if you've read any of these books and if you'd recommend them too, or if there are any, or if you're keen on reading any of these books as well. Please let me know about that in the comments below. But I hope you're reading good things and taking time and savoring the literature that you are currently reading. Just not racing through to get to everything. But yeah, hope you're doing well and having a good day. And I'll speak to you again soon. Bye bye.